a late start. We're going to run, I think, until 6:43, but I see a hand right here. Go for it. You start, and I'm going to try to, the lights are in my eyes, so I can't see people's hands. Now it's better. But go ahead and start.
Okay, I'll try to be real quick. What I love about this panel, thank you, is this is the first panel, I think, where the stakes are clear and we have a real debate. I happen to agree with Elissa, but I think this gets us going for this generic concept of fascism again. And my question, which also I think would be good for Renato, but I'll give it to you, Enzo, because you definitely raised it. I don't quite understand what it is that makes fascism as a concept, as Elissa points out, so problematic as an ideal type in applying why we even need post-fascism as a concept. If you take the differences in the last 100 years between, say, Giovanni Gentile and Steve Bannon, they're much smaller than Trotsky or Mao and Bernie Sanders or Olaf Scholz. So we can't, if we're going to use socialism or liberalism, right, from the 20s and 30s and now, I don't see what it is, especially because I think empirically, some of us in the room would say, you exaggerate the degree of modernity, anti-Semitism, and futurism that defined all fascisms in the 20s and 30s, and you underplay the degree of kind of, I guess, futurism, xenophobia, racism, and other things that we would attach to modern toxic masculinity, fascism now. So that's my first question. Can we really say that this is different, this is, you know, not on a continuum, especially given the changes in kind of neoliberal capitalism? We don't have capital, labor, and a working class, and know what we did in the 20s and 30s. It doesn't mean fascism doesn't exist. It means the context is different. And then related to that, there's a kind of radical historicist bent, in a way, in your methodology by saying post-fascist. Why isn't it proto-fascist? If fascism...
Proto
or pre. Fascism can be in a state of becoming again, so maybe it's not quite there yet.
Yeah.
But why would we say it's a new moment where it's only post-fascist? Maybe history goes in cycles. So those are my two questions.
Okay, so Eric gave us several within those two, but I think we should collect a few more. I did see one more hand back there, and then Lou, and then I'll see you in the next round. So go ahead.
So first, thank you for a wonderful panel. I wanted to draw out two of the paradoxes that both of you had discussed. Alyssa, you had mentioned, rightfully so, that some of the most successful strongmen are in fact women. So why has this worked in political parties that celebrate traditional hierarchies? I wonder if the answer might lie in some of the splintering that Enzo had suggested. The fact that we have these paradoxical subgroups in post-fascist groups. I'm thinking of, for example, La Foresta che Avanza, a group that suggests that they are an environmental and yet post-fascist group at the same time. It seems like a contradiction in terms. So I would be curious as to what you think.
Okay, let's get some answers from that.
We can gather all the questions.
Gather them all. We don't have to. Okay, the people we have on the list are Lou and Sven, Atina, the gentleman behind Diana, and one more person there. So, yeah. Okay, so Lou.
I'm very glad that Elissa finally broached the gender issue. And I think it's really important to say that Mosse had a really complicated relationship with gender. In some ways, I think he invented gender as a category of analysis, avant la lettre, in Nationalism and Sexuality. And in that book, and in other of his writings, he clearly shows that the first fascism was deeply immersed in gender issues, issues of sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity. We're talking about the phenomena of the new woman in the 1920s and 1930s, and also the sort of blooming of homosexual, nonpolar sexual identities. So I think it's really important for you. You talked about it in contemporary time, but this was a crucial part. And just following up Elissa's concerns that the seminar at Stanford was all white men. But I've never been able to figure out why Mosse, who invented gender, would in fact separate it from his analysis of fascism. And I think it's because Foucault hadn't happened yet until the 1980s. When Mosse did read Foucault, I had initially a very negative response to it. At that point, he was very immersed in Freudian categories. But I don't think Mosse could think about politics, the politics of traditional juridical and institutional politics, connect that with the politics of the bedroom, or think about the ways in which people position themselves in terms of gender and sexuality as political, as having a politics. So I think Mosse typifies the ways in which gender was a blind spot for white academics in the 60s, and it wasn't until I think Foucault opened up our eyes to the fact that politics exists everywhere, and that much of fascism is not conceived in the boardroom or the factory or the juridical apparatus of a state, but in fact on the street, looking at women, looking at what women are doing, going to cabarets, understanding new sexual orientations, a much more social and cultural notion of fascism. Yeah, that's it.
All right, Sven. And then comes the team.
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and for your very thoughtful, thought-provoking paper and the discussion, which I'm very much looked forward to hear. Well, I limit myself to only two remarks. First is the term post-fascism. I'm not very convinced that it's leading to something we should, I mean, it is not fascism 2.0 because neo-fascism relies heavily on classical historical fascism. And what we observed right now is fascism 3.0 because it has not this clear, I mean, relation to the classical period. And as you showed in your paper, it is not post-fascism, is something else. And you strengthened the differences, and so far I wouldn't talk about post-fascism. But my main point, I'm not a Marxist, but I want to say something on the societal and cultural conditions under which classical fascism and fascism 3.0 developed. And there seems to me some astonishing similarities, not only differences, as far as globalization is concerned nowadays, and the losers of this modernization process, and what we can observe in the 1920s and 1930s. So this, I mean, economic conditions seem to be quite comparable, and also cultural, because I'm not a Marxist, a cultural similarity is quite striking that we can observe, sorry, I have to read my notes, the changing of the communication system, this changing of the media system, and this kind of dramatization, emotionalization of public debate you can observe in the newspapers, in the yellow press, in the tabloid journalism of the 20s and 30s, in the new illustrated magazines. And this kind of fragmentation you can observe in the 20s. Milieu is then the key word, and nowadays it's the media bubbles and the social media. So this fragmentation of the public sphere seems to me very comparable to what has happened in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for this very intense and stimulating panel. So just two things which I think are related, and they both have to do with the 1970s. And so, you know, the afterlife of that 63 conference, which was, after all, pre the upheavals that then really started agitating that portion of the 20th century, sort of what we call 68, and then which George certainly engaged with a great deal in Madison, and Andy can tell us about what that meant. And then sort of in the 1970s, the implosion of that 1960s New Left, in part because of sort of a turn to notions of armed struggle, which in turn were a response to visions of what was then seen as a revival of fascism. So I wanted, I wanted to sort of press that question of the 70s, just by sort of as a little aside, but I connected, I think, I mean, it occurs to me that there are two white men in the 70s who do actually take up the question of women and gender very differently, and sexuality in very interesting ways. And one is Tim Mason in '76 with that, extraordinary article about women and work in Nazi Germany, which was motivated by the search. Whoops, I feel like I'm yelling into this thing. Which was motivated by the search not for, why does fascism, why does fascism come to power, but where is the opposition to fascism? And I mean, he then opened up, I think, a whole field. And the other person, of course, is Tevelheit, who, interestingly, we haven't even gotten to yet, who thought a great deal about sexuality and fascism. But sort of, and then the other, so that's sort of two history, and that was 77, so 76, 77, and then. At the same time, 77 is Der Rote Herbst in Germany. I mean, Der Heiß, the hot autumn, with the rise of the Red, sort of the Red Army Fraktion, right, RAF, and in Italy, the Red Brigades, and then in the U.S., sort of even earlier, the Weathermen, right, and all of those movements claimed their right to engage in violent and militant resistance on the basis of fighting against a resurgent fascism. And so I'm thinking of whether it might be useful for all of our discussions to historicize the 70s in a more, in a deeper and sort of more challenging way than we have. So I wanted to ask about the 70s.
Okay, there's been one incredibly patient gentleman in the back. Would someone want to say something or not?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, thank you for these papers. I'm really interested in seeing the final versions of these in particular. Enzo, I have a question for you. You mentioned in your presentation post-fascism as being more neoconservative than fascist, and I presume that you were speaking probably most saliently about Fratelli d'Italia, the more obvious example. I just had a couple of observations that I wanted, if I can get your thoughts on. Fratelli d'Italia is unique among the political parties in Italy, major political parties. In participating in a kind of neo-fascist political culture and memoryscape, particularly having to do with the Anni di Piombo. Giorgia Meloni had been a member of the Fronte della Gioventù during her youth in the 1980s. After the collapse of the MSI in '95, she was the national leader of the Alleanza Nazionale's youth group, Azione Studentesca. And Fratelli d'Italia, again, unique among all political parties in Italy, save Casa Pound Italia, Forza Nuova, who are openly neo-fascist, participates in these Anni di Piombo commemorations, most recently the Acca Larenzia killings on January the 7th, 1978. No other party, including La Lega, participates in commemorating La Foibe, commemorating Acca Larenzia, Sergio Ramelli, the Mattei brothers. And so I think of these as sort of Geertzian winks at sort of revealing the underlying motivations of the Fratelli group, despite the rebranding, the kind of political rebranding of being sort of conservatori and sovranisti, right? They kind of put that front out there for the general public while sort of winking to their base about their neo-fascist roots and values. And so I wondered if you could offer any comments to that effect.
Okay, I think I have Austin and Pam. Is there anybody else who feels neglected? Or
We're not going to answer these questions.
they're over there, yeah. And Austin, okay.
Is there, should I pass the...
Austin, Pam.
Yeah, thank you. I have more of a question than a comment. I was really intrigued, Professor Traverso, what you said about post-fascism, whatever we want to call it, fascism 2.0, not having a futurity, that it has no concept of the future. And I was wondering, because I suspect that you're right, and I wonder what the role of the apocalypse has, possibly in an apocalyptic worldview, in not being able to conceive of a future state, whether here on Earth or wherever. And I don't know if it would be because of a post-atomic age or because of maybe climate collapse. But I'm also thinking of, within the American context, particularly the strain of premillennialism, which is so potent in the American far right and has been over the century. If I had more time, I'd go into how every, from the Ku Klux Klan that you mentioned to support of the State of Israel, how premillennialism is so influential in all of those, but we can talk about that at dinner. But yeah, I guess just, is there like an apocalyptic affect to the far right today that might have a role there?
Anne and Annette. So Annette's going first or Pam's going first?
That's okay.
Oh, sorry, you'll get the final word.
I wanted to ask a question about the places, because you have been blowing up all the lines of time, but in our post-colonial world, no name about the places where the women are the most badly treated, and the men and the children around the world. Afghanistan will be the first, or Iran, or China. A lot could be added. Why to stay in Europe, since you don't stay with chronology? Why to stay with space about fascism?
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. Just to second some of the caution about the argument of, or the label of post-fascist. Did I just lose this? Sorry, post-fascist or para-fascist or various, fascism 2.0. But I am wondering, I mean, all the presenters talked about a wide range of far-right movements in the contemporary moment. And going to Enzo's specific point about the loss of the working class to the right, I'm thinking about how in the first Trump term, there were many commentators who were nervous to use the language of fascism and use the term populism, right? And I think we're hearing less of that now, but I'm wondering for all of you, what do we think of populism as conceptually for certain forms of political behavior that we're seeing in the moment? The demonization of the elites, the unmediated belief in the people, charismatic leadership, and so on. So again, I mean, populism has a whole other set of debates about its definition and application, but thank you for that.
Okay. Which one of you wants to go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't you go first and then Enzo? That makes sense.
So I will be brief. So I start with Annette. I stayed with Europe because I am aware that this is Eurocentric, but it's what I know most. So at least I speak the 3 languages, and I follow the news. So as I said, I am out of my historical comfort zone. But I think, if not this seminar, where can we test and experiment? And I think. I agree with Atina. We should bring the 70s in, and it's not my place because I'm not a historian specialized or like a specialist on that. But we have everything we need here to bring it in and do it differently than the Stanford seminar. So I think we should do that as a collaborative thinking process. Same goes for Sven. Yes, I think I hear you, and you're certainly more into this debate defining fascism, and so maybe again this is our job here, possibly to come up with maybe not with new terminology, but with new questions, with new methodologies, with something different. So, and I really look forward to the next days. So, Lou, yeah, I was also amazed that Mosse is actually in this manuscript rather the only one who brings up sexuality and women. But it's interesting what you say, that he did write a book, but he doesn't bring it in the big political debate, historical. And I think for me, this morning was very, very interesting, and I learned a lot. And as a historian of everyday life, I really plead, we need to sociologize. We need to do history of science, which means also to put the historians to question, to sociologize. And so I think cohorts and generation play a role, but also peer pressure. So Mosse is this fabulous guy, but he also, he probably also did not feel comfortable to share that with his intellectual bodies, because it was not taken. It is, I quote Cynthia Enlow again, but it is about being taken seriously. So he had this great pioneering, he was a pioneer in taking fascism seriously, but at the same time, well, he did not dare to take sexuality and this pre-gender concept into this political discussion. Yeah. And then the strong women, that is a very interesting question with why is it, I mean, Nazi Germany was certainly on the agenda, was not liberating women, but actually if you analyze Nazi Germany at war, you see that, that it was a regime that really put women to work and offered, especially to unmarried and childless women, a fabulous professional careers, or at least a way out of being stuck with their with husbands or with their fathers and families, so to really make a living of their own. And so I think, to me, the key aspect is, and it's not me, it's Annette Tim, it's Dagmar Herzog. There's really a variety of research on this, is inclusionary racism. It's a key ingredient, because inclusionary racism, if race tops gender, then you, as a woman, as a white, non-Jewish, Aryan woman, you are superior to Polish people, to Polish men also, that you can also attack verbally and physically on the street, because you are sitting in a different train section than these Polish people occupied by the Nazi Germany. So I think that is inclusionary racism is something that we have to study and we have to bring into debate today, because otherwise we always hear, but we're not racist, but inclusionary racism is a form of racism. And yeah, I think that is everything I have to say. Thanks.
Yeah. So my answers certainly will be unsatisfactory, because there were too many very crucial questions that were put forward, and I have no time to answer all of them. I will not follow the order of the questions. I will start from some specific issues before coming back to the crucial issue of post-fascism, of this concept. But so, is there a fascist or post-fascist radical right apocalyptic imagination? I think so. I think we can answer positively to this question. But this apocalypse is certainly not climate change. The apocalypse is rather multiculturalism, Islamic invasion, babies with gay and lesbian parents, and so on and so on. So this kind of apocalypse is central in the post-fascist discourse. Why I don't speak of populism, and so this is a relevant debate. I'm very skeptical with respect to this concept, and I don't say that fascism or post-fascism is not populist. Of course it's populist, but the question is, what does populism mean? In my view, populism is a rhetorical figure, a figure of speech, is a political style. Populism consists in opposing the corrupted elite to the virtuous people and so on. And this kind of political style belongs to both a left-wing and a right-wing political discourse. But if we accept to conceptualize this political style into a strong category of populism, I think that the result is that is very problematic, because we are unable to distinguish between two radically different political phenomena, which are the radical left and the radical right. And we fall in the same ambiguities of the concept of totalitarianism, for instance, which certainly has some virtues, some heuristic potentialities, but which is, I think, unable to analyze the true nature of certain political, historical experiences and political phenomena. Well, national populism is maybe a more nuanced definition. Nonetheless, so the category of populism is mostly used in order to establish an equivalence between radical right and radical left. And from this point of view, I think it is a very dangerous and equivocous categories. So I proposed the concept of post-fascism 10 years ago, when I wrote an article on this topic, and at that time, Giorgia Meloni was a marginal figure in the Italian political landscape. I rather tried to apply this concept, so before Giorgia Meloni came to power in Italy, to some political leaders like Marine Le Pen in France, who clearly, openly, explicitly broke with the ideological tradition embodied by her father, or to people like Donald Trump, who has a very vague idea of what fascism was in historical terms. So but I'm not opposed at all to the concept of fascism for depicting these 21st century radical rights, or to the concept of new fascism used, proposed by Elissa. But I also found interesting arguments in Renato Moro's criticism of the concept of fascism and post-fascism, of fascism. And I said, well, in my presentation, I stressed many significant, relevant discrepancies separating classical fascism from contemporary radical rights. And I tried, through the concept of post-fascism, to grasp this mix of historical continuity and ideological and political transformation and cultural transformation, because what I call post-fascism belongs not only to a different historical context, I would say also to a different anthropological context, because of neoliberalism, because of individualism, because of a new place of women in society. And of course, it's obvious that in the 1930s, it would have been unthinkable a mass fascist movement led by a woman. Well, that's clear. Well, I'm not particularly attached to this concept of post-fascism, but I don't find other more interesting or better definitions. So that's the point. And I stressed that post-fascism is not a concept with an epistemic status as strong as liberalism, fascism, communism, anarchism, and so on. Is a concept trying to grasp a transitional step, a transitional phenomenon. And, well, maybe I agree that between the fascist intellectuals, thinkers of the 30s and Steve Bannon, there are probably more affinities than between Trotsky and Bernie Sanders. Well, but this is also the reason for which I don't depict Bernie Sanders as a Bolshevik or as a Trotskyist. So we should try to nuance. I can make just one more point, which was mentioned by Renato Moro in his intervention, and which is related to the legacy of anti-fascism. So this question was also approached by Andy Rabinbach in his presentation. I think that it would be important to reintroduce anti-fascism in this discussion about fascism. So, speaking of anti-fascism inevitably means trying to historicize anti-fascism. And anti-fascism can be recognized as an extremely important political phenomenon with his political ethos, which was central in the struggle against fascism, but so it's not difficult to recognize its limits. Anti-fascism depicted fascism as a kind of regression of civilization into barbarism without grasping and understanding the roots of fascism in modernity. But and maybe today this kind of misunderstanding is reproduced in the way in which Donald Trump is approached and defined. But okay, sorry. Sorry.
Thank you all.